You're nothing without me. Ethan Walker's voice cut through the courtroom with the cold certainty of a man who believed he had already won. The words hung in the air for a moment, sharp and heavy, before silence settled across the room like a storm cloud. Naomi Carter stood at the petitioner's table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her expression calm despite the dozens of eyes fixed on her. The fluorescent lights above reflected softly against the polished wood benches, and somewhere near the back row, a chair creaked as someone shifted uncomfortably. Ethan straightened the sleeve of his expensive navy suit and let out a short laugh, the kind meant to humiliate rather than entertain. He glanced toward his attorney and shook his head as if the entire proceeding were a waste of his valuable time. To him, this divorce hearing was merely the final formality before closing a chapter he thought he controlled from beginning to end. Naomi did not answer. She simply looked ahead, her dark eyes steady, focused on a point beyond the courtroom doors. That silence irritated Ethan more than any argument ever could. For years, he had expected reactions. Anger, tears, pleading. But today there was none of that. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that made people uneasy. Outside the tall courthouse windows, gray rain tapped softly against the glass. The sky over downtown Atlanta looked heavy and distant, wrapping the city in a muted silver haze. The sound blended with the low hum of the building's air conditioning and the rustle of legal documents being arranged on nearby desks. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Look at you," he said with a smirk. "You still think walking into a courtroom changes anything." A few people exchanged glances. Even his own lawyer shifted in his seat. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, not in surrender, but as though gathering her thoughts. Then she lifted her gaze again. Calm, unshaken. Ethan felt a flicker of annoyance. He had expected today to feel triumphant. Instead, something about the room felt different. Unsettled. The court clerk near the front desk checked the clock for the third time in less than 5 minutes. A bailiff standing beside the entrance adjusted his posture and glanced toward the hallway beyond the double doors. The movement was subtle, but Naomi noticed it. Ethan did not. He was too busy enjoying what he believed was his victory lap. He looked around at the spectators, then back at Naomi. After today, he said quietly enough that only those nearby could hear, "You'll finally understand what happens when you challenge the wrong person." Naomi's face revealed nothing. Yet deep inside, her heartbeat remained steady. She had spent years learning how to survive storms. And standing beneath the cold courtroom lights, listening to the rain whisper against the windows, she had the strange feeling that this storm was not arriving. It had already begun. Naomi Carter had learned long ago that silence could be stronger than an argument. As the rain continued to trace thin lines down the courthouse windows, her thoughts drifted far from the polished courtroom and the man sitting across from her. There had been a time when Ethan Walker looked different in her eyes. 15 years earlier, he had been charming, ambitious, and endlessly persuasive. He had talked about building a future together, about creating a family that would prove love mattered more than background, race, or status. Naomi had believed him. Back then, she was finishing graduate school while working late shifts at a community outreach center on the south side of Atlanta. She believed in people. She believed effort could overcome prejudice. Most of all, she believed promises. The wedding photos had once filled an entire hallway in their home. Smiling faces, summer sunlight, friends cheering beneath strings of white lights. Looking back now, those memories felt like photographs left too long in the sun, faded around the edges until only fragments remained. The first few years had been good, or at least they had seemed that way. Ethan's business grew quickly. New clients arrived. Bigger contracts followed. A modest house became a larger one. Then a larger one became an estate behind iron gates and carefully trimmed hedges. Somewhere during that climb, something changed. Success wrapped itself around Ethan like a second skin. Conversations became instructions. Appreciation became expectation. Naomi noticed it in small moments at first. The way he interrupted her during dinner parties. The way he dismissed her opinions when executives were present. The way he smiled politely in public but spoke differently once the doors closed. None of it happened overnight. It arrived slowly, one compromise at a time, until she barely recognized the life she was living. Yet she stayed. She stayed because she believed people could change. She stayed because she remembered the man she thought she had married. Most of all, She stayed because leaving felt like admitting failure. The clock above the courtroom entrance ticked softly. Each second echoed through the room with surprising clarity. Naomi looked toward the gallery. A few spectators watched quietly. Some appeared curious. Others seemed sympathetic. None of them knew the years hidden beneath the legal paperwork stacked neatly before her. They saw a divorce case. She saw thousands of mornings spent hoping things would improve. Ethan shifted in his chair and glanced at his watch. His confidence remained intact. The expensive silver timepiece reflected the overhead lights as he tapped one finger against the armrest. He looked relaxed, almost amused. Naomi wondered if he had ever truly understood how much had been lost. Perhaps not. Some people only measured success in numbers. Revenue, property, investments, market share. They never learned how to measure trust. A gust of wind rattled the courthouse windows. The sound drew her attention back to the present. Near the front desk, the court clerk checked the hallway again. The movement was brief, but impossible to ignore. Even the bailiff seemed unusually alert. Ethan noticed none of it. He was busy whispering something to his attorney, both men smiling as though discussing a favorable business deal rather than the collapse of a marriage. Naomi folded her hands together. Her breathing remained steady. Deep inside, she felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not anger, relief. For years, she had carried the weight of proving her worth to someone determined not to see it. Today that burden felt lighter. The outcome of the hearing mattered, but not for the reasons Ethan imagined. He thought this day was about winning. Naomi knew it was about ending. Ending doubt. Ending excuses. Ending the long habit of shrinking herself to fit inside someone else's expectations. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the distant skyline. Inside, the double doors at the rear of the courtroom remained closed. The room seemed to hold its breath. And for the first time that morning, Naomi allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile. Across the aisle, Ethan Walker looked completely at ease. If anyone had entered the courtroom at that moment without knowing the circumstances, they might have mistaken him for a man attending a routine business meeting rather than a hearing that would formally end a 15-year marriage. He sat comfortably in his tailored suit, one arm resting along the chair, the faint confidence of success visible in every movement. Ethan had spent most of his adult life believing that preparation guaranteed victory. In business, that belief had served him well. He had built Walker Strategic Holdings from a small consulting firm into a company operating across multiple states. His name appeared in business magazines. He spoke at leadership conferences. Young entrepreneurs quoted his interviews online. To the outside world, he represented discipline, intelligence, and achievement. But success had created another habit. It taught him that most obstacles eventually moved out of his way. Contracts could be negotiated. Competitors could be outmaneuvered. Problems could be solved with influence, resources, or patience. Over time, he stopped distinguishing between challenges and people. Everyone became part of a calculation. Everyone became a variable to manage. Even Naomi. Ethan glanced toward her and felt the same irritation returning. Her calm bothered him more than any accusation could have. During the weeks leading up to the hearing, he had expected resistance. He expected angry phone calls, emotional confrontations, desperate negotiations. Instead, Naomi had remained remarkably composed. She signed what needed signing. She attended every meeting. She answered every request through her attorney. The absence of drama felt unnatural to him. It was almost as though she had stopped trying to convince him of anything. That thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Beside him, his attorney, Richard Coleman, quietly reviewed a stack of documents. Richard had practiced family law for nearly 3 decades and carried himself with the calm efficiency of a man who rarely encountered surprises. Earlier that morning, he had assured Ethan that everything appeared favorable. The financial disclosures were complete. The settlement framework was clear. Procedurally, there was little room for uncertainty. Ethan had smiled when he heard those words. Favorable. That was exactly how he viewed the day. Favorable. Across the room, however, he noticed something strange. The usual pre-hearing routine seemed delayed. Court personnel appeared attentive in a way he could not quite explain. The clerk checked her schedule twice. The bailiff exchanged a brief glance with someone in the hallway. Even Richard eventually paused reading and looked toward the entrance before returning to his paperwork. Ethan dismissed it. Courthouses were full of small bureaucratic delays. There was always some procedural issue, some scheduling adjustment, some administrative complication. None of it concerned him. He leaned back and crossed one leg over the other. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows. The gray afternoon light filtered into the courtroom, giving the polished wood surfaces a muted shine. Ethan remembered another rainy day years ago, the day he first met Naomi. She had been volunteering at a community event while he attended as a young executive seeking networking opportunities. He remembered her smile, her confidence, the way she seemed able to make strangers feel welcome within seconds. For a brief moment, the memory surfaced unexpectedly. Then he pushed it aside. Nostalgia served no purpose today. The hearing was about moving forward. At least that was what he told himself. Yet somewhere beneath the certainty, beneath the confidence, beneath the carefully constructed image of a man in complete control, a faint sense of discomfort had begun to grow. It was small, barely noticeable, like the first distant rumble of thunder before a storm. Ethan adjusted his cufflinks and looked again toward the courtroom doors. They remained closed. The room felt unusually still, and although he would never admit it aloud, he suddenly found himself wondering what everyone else seemed to be waiting for. The silence stretched long enough for people to notice it. Courtrooms were rarely quiet in a meaningful way. There was always movement, always paperwork, always the low rhythm of legal business unfolding. But this silence felt different. It carried expectation. Naomi sensed it in the way the clerk kept straightening files that were already perfectly aligned. She saw it in the way the bailiff occasionally glanced toward the hallway before returning to attention. Even the spectators seemed unusually patient, as though nobody wanted to miss whatever came next. Ethan noticed the atmosphere now, but instead of questioning it, he interpreted it as confirmation of his own importance. In his experience, people always paid attention when significant outcomes were about to occur. He assumed the room revolved around him. He folded his hands and leaned toward Richard Coleman. "How much longer can this delay go on?" he asked quietly. Richard glanced at his watch. "Not much longer. These things happen." Ethan nodded. His confidence returned immediately. Delays were minor inconveniences. They did not change outcomes. They certainly did not threaten someone in his position. Across the room, Naomi remained composed. She could hear the rain easing outside. The steady tapping against the windows had softened into an occasional whisper. Sunlight was trying to break through the clouds somewhere beyond the gray skyline. The faint shift in brightness touched the edges of the courtroom, reflecting softly across the polished wood railings and the brass fixtures near the judge's bench. Naomi looked at the empty chair positioned above the courtroom floor. Most people entering a hearing focused on the attorneys, the evidence, or the arguments. Few paid attention to the chair itself. Yet that chair carried authority. It transformed opinions into decisions and emotions into legal outcomes. Today, however, Naomi found herself thinking less about authority and more about responsibility. She remembered a lesson she had learned years ago from someone she deeply respected. Real power was not measured by how loudly someone spoke. It was measured by what they did when nobody was watching. The memory surfaced briefly before fading again. Ethan cleared his throat. "You know," he said suddenly, his voice carrying farther than intended. "Some people spend years pretending they are victims when they simply made poor choices." Several heads turned. Richard gave him a subtle warning look, but Ethan ignored it. He continued staring across the aisle. Naomi did not respond. Her calm expression remained unchanged. That only encouraged him further. Eventually, reality catches up with everyone. His words hung in the air. Nobody answered. Nobody agreed. The courtroom seemed to absorb the statement and let it disappear. Ethan shifted in his seat. For the first time, the lack of reaction felt disappointing. He expected validation. Instead, he received silence. The clerk closed a folder. The soft sound echoed unexpectedly loud. Somewhere in the hallway beyond the double doors, footsteps became audible. Slow, deliberate, professional. The bailiff immediately straightened. The clerk rose slightly from her chair before sitting again. Several spectators exchanged glances. Even Richard stopped reviewing documents. Ethan followed their attention toward the entrance. The footsteps continued. Closer now, measured and unhurried. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly and released a slow breath. Her heartbeat remained steady. Whatever happened next had been moving toward this moment for years. Not because of a courtroom, Not because of legal filings. Because every choice eventually arrives at its destination. Ethan watched the doors, suddenly aware that the strange anticipation filling the room had nothing to do with him. The realization was subtle, almost impossible to describe, yet impossible to ignore. For the first time all morning, uncertainty touched the edges of his confidence. The brass handle turned slightly. The room became completely still. Every conversation ended. Every movement stopped. Outside, a thin beam of sunlight finally broke through the clouds and stretched across the courtroom floor. And then the doors began to open. The courtroom rose as one. The sound of chairs shifting across the polished floor created a brief wave of motion before everything settled again. A woman in a black judicial robe entered with calm, measured steps, carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions. Her silver-streaked hair was neatly arranged, and her expression revealed nothing beyond professional focus. Judge Evelyn Carter approached the bench without hesitation. The moment Ethan saw her face, the color seemed to drain from his own. His posture stiffened instantly. For a second, he looked less like a successful executive and more like a man who had suddenly misplaced his footing. Richard Coleman noticed the change immediately. "Ethan," he whispered. But Ethan did not answer. He simply stared. Judge Evelyn Carter. Naomi's mother. The same woman he had not seen in nearly 6 years. The same woman who had quietly disappeared from family gatherings after disagreements neither side had ever fully repaired. Around the courtroom, nobody reacted because nobody knew what Ethan knew. To them, she was simply the judge assigned to the case. To Ethan, her appearance felt impossible. He had assumed someone else would preside. He had never checked the assignment. Why would he? Details like that rarely concerned him. Yet now, every confident assumption he had carried into the room suddenly felt fragile. Naomi remained seated. Her expression did not change. She watched her mother take the bench with the same calm she had carried all morning. Judge Carter adjusted several files, reviewed a document, and then looked across the courtroom. Her gaze moved methodically from one side to the other. Professional, neutral, unreadable. When her eyes briefly passed over Naomi, there was no visible sign of recognition. When they passed over Ethan, there was none either. The absence of reaction unsettled him even more. He expected surprise. He expected discomfort. He expected something. Instead, he found only discipline. The clerk began reviewing procedural matters while Judge Carter listened carefully. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady and clear. Every word carried authority without effort. The room responded immediately. Conversation stopped. Attention sharpened. Ethan swallowed and adjusted his tie. Suddenly it felt tighter than before. Richard leaned closer. "Do you know the judge?" he asked quietly. Ethan hesitated. "A long time ago." Richard frowned. "Is that going to be an issue?" Ethan forced a small laugh. "No, of course not." But even as he said the words, he was not entirely sure he believed them. Across the aisle, Naomi lowered her eyes toward the table for a moment. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. She remembered studying late at night while her mother worked long hours building a legal career. She remembered lessons about integrity, responsibility, and patience. Most of all, she remembered being told that character revealed itself when circumstances became difficult. Looking at the bench now, she wondered whether Ethan understood that lesson yet. Judge Carter reviewed another page before setting it aside. "Before we proceed," she said, her voice carrying easily throughout the room, "I want to remind both parties that this court is concerned with facts, evidence, and lawful procedure. Personal assumptions and emotional narratives will not determine the outcome. The truth will." The statement was simple, yet something about the way she delivered it caused an unusual stillness to settle over the room. Ethan shifted again. For the first time that morning, winning no longer felt inevitable. Outside, the clouds continued breaking apart, allowing thin streams of sunlight to reach the courthouse windows. Inside, the hearing was finally beginning. And as Judge Carter opened the first file and looked directly toward the attorneys, Ethan realized the day was not unfolding according to the script he had written in his mind. The hearing moved forward with measured precision. Documents were exchanged. Dates were confirmed. Financial records were referenced one after another. To anyone watching from the gallery, the process appeared ordinary. Yet beneath the formal language and procedural routine, something deeper was unfolding. Judge Evelyn Carter listened carefully to every statement without interruption. She rarely took notes, but when she did, the movement of her pen seemed deliberate, as though each word carried weight. Ethan found himself paying closer attention to her than to the actual discussion. He searched for some sign that the family connection mattered. A glance, a hesitation, anything. Instead, she remained completely professional. The realization frustrated him. Part of him had expected discomfort. Another part had expected sympathy for Naomi. What he encountered instead was neutrality. Absolute neutrality. It left him with no obvious advantage and no convenient excuse. Richard presented several financial summaries, income statements, property valuations, investment records. The language was technical and precise. Judge Carter reviewed each document with the patience of someone who had spent years separating facts from assumptions. Every so often she asked a question. Not dramatic questions, simple ones, clarifying ones. Yet each question seemed to expose details that Ethan had assumed would pass unnoticed. By midday, the confidence he carried into the courtroom felt noticeably heavier. Naomi sat quietly beside her attorney, listening more than speaking. The sunlight outside had fully broken through the clouds now. Warm light filtered across the windows and stretched across the courtroom floor. Dust particles drifted lazily through the golden beams. The contrast between the bright afternoon and the tension inside the room felt almost symbolic. Naomi noticed it. She also noticed something else. For the first time all morning, Ethan appeared tired. Not physically tired, mentally tired. The kind of fatigue that comes when control begins slipping away in small, unexpected ways. Judge Carter turned another page and paused. Her eyes remained focused on the file before her. I would like clarification regarding several transfers made during the final 2 years of the marriage, she said calmly. Richard immediately reached for additional paperwork. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. The transfers were legal. He knew they were legal. Yet hearing them discussed aloud created an uncomfortable pressure he could not explain. Numbers that once existed quietly inside spreadsheets now echoed through the courtroom. Dates, accounts, decisions. Each one became part of a larger picture. Naomi remained still. Years earlier, these discussions would have terrified her. She would have worried about appearances. She would have worried about conflict. Today she felt strangely peaceful. Not because she expected a particular outcome, because she no longer feared the truth. Judge Carter reviewed the documents for several moments before setting them aside. The room fell quiet again. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees lining the courthouse plaza. Their shadows shifted across the windows like slow-moving waves. Inside, even the spectators seemed absorbed by the growing tension. Ethan loosened his grip on a pen he had not realized he was holding so tightly. The polished metal felt cold against his fingers. Across the aisle, Naomi looked toward the sunlight resting across the floor. For years, she had spent countless nights wondering whether speaking up would change anything, whether standing her ground would matter, whether dignity could survive disappointment. Sitting there now, she finally understood something simple. Peace did not come from winning. It came from no longer carrying what was never yours to carry. Judge Carter closed the file in front of her and looked up. Her expression remained composed, but there was a new focus in her eyes. The kind of focus that appears when separate pieces begin fitting together. Ethan noticed it immediately, and for reasons he could not fully explain, a quiet sense of concern settled into his chest as the afternoon hearing continued. The afternoon light had shifted by the time the next series of documents reached the bench. Long golden reflections stretched across the courtroom floor, turning the polished wood surfaces warm and bright. Judge Evelyn Carter reviewed the material in silence while the room waited. Nobody seemed eager to speak. Even the usual sounds of shuffling papers had faded. The hearing had entered a different stage now. Facts were no longer appearing as isolated details. They were beginning to form a pattern. Ethan watched carefully as Judge Carter turned page after page. At first, he told himself there was nothing unusual about the process. Judges reviewed evidence every day. That was their job. Yet something about her concentration unsettled him. She was not rushing. She was not reacting emotionally. She was connecting pieces. Richard Coleman leaned forward and quietly organized additional records on the table. His confidence had become noticeably more reserved. Earlier that morning, he had projected certainty. Now he appeared focused on precision. Across the aisle, Naomi sat quietly beside her attorney. She felt no satisfaction watching the atmosphere change. Only a growing sense that years of unanswered questions were finally being examined in the open. Judge Carter paused at a particular document and adjusted her glasses slightly. Her eyes remained fixed on the page for several seconds longer than before. Then she looked toward Richard. "Counselor, I would appreciate clarification regarding the timeline associated with these transactions." Her voice remained calm, professional, neutral. Richard immediately stood and began explaining. Dates, accounts, business restructuring decisions. The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface. Yet as he spoke, Judge Carter asked several follow-up questions. Each one was concise. Each one focused on details that had received little attention earlier. Ethan felt an unfamiliar tension settle across his shoulders. He listened carefully. None of the questions sounded hostile, yet they revealed something important. The court was examining substance rather than appearance. That distinction mattered more than he wanted to admit. The spectators followed the exchange with growing interest. A woman seated near the back leaned forward slightly. A man holding a legal notepad stopped writing altogether. Even the clerk seemed unusually attentive. The room sensed a shift, although nobody could yet define it. Naomi glanced briefly toward the windows. Outside, the storm had completely passed. The sky above Atlanta was clear now, washed in soft afternoon light. Cars moved along distant streets. Life continued beyond the courthouse walls. For the first time in years, she imagined a future that did not revolve around conflict. The thought felt strange and comforting at the same time. Judge Carter reviewed another file, then another. Finally, she placed both documents side by side. The movement was small, but Ethan noticed it immediately. Something had connected, something important. He could feel it. The confidence that once seemed effortless now required effort to maintain. He adjusted his tie again and looked toward Richard, hoping to find reassurance. Instead, he found concentration. Nothing more. Judge Carter folded her hands. "The court is not interested in assumptions," she said. "The court is interested in consistency. When records, timelines, and decisions align, clarity follows." The statement sounded simple, yet the effect inside the courtroom was immediate. Several people exchanged brief glances. Ethan looked down at the table. For years, he had built his life around controlling outcomes, planning ahead, anticipating risks, staying several moves ahead of everyone else. Today, however, he felt as though he was seeing the board differently for the first time. Across from him, Naomi remained calm. Not triumphant, not emotional, simply present. The sunlight resting across the courtroom floor continued creeping forward inch by inch. And as Judge Carter reached for the next file waiting beside her bench, Ethan realized the hearing was no longer moving where he expected it to go. Judge Carter opened the final file, and the atmosphere inside the courtroom changed almost immediately. The shift was subtle at first, like the moment before a curtain rises. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even the air seemed heavier. Sunlight continued pouring through the tall windows, illuminating the bench in a warm golden glow. Judge Carter reviewed several pages in silence before looking toward both legal teams. Her expression remained composed, yet there was a firmness in her eyes that had not been there earlier. "The court has reviewed the submitted records, supporting documentation, and correspondence associated with the financial disclosures," she said. Her voice carried clearly across the room. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Richard Coleman sat straighter. Naomi listened quietly. Judge Carter continued. "Several decisions presented as routine business matters appear closely connected to events occurring within the marriage itself. Context matters. Timing matters. Patterns matter." The words were careful, professional, yet each one landed with unmistakable weight. Richard immediately began clarifying the reasoning behind various transactions. He spoke confidently, referencing legal standards and corporate procedures. For a few moments, the explanation seemed to restore balance. Then Judge Carter asked another question. A simple question, one focused on timing rather than legality. Richard answered. She asked another, then another. Each answer revealed additional details. Not wrongdoing, not scandal, something far more difficult to dismiss. A pattern. The spectators followed the exchange closely. Heads turned. Pens paused above notepads. Ethan stared at the documents spread before him. The numbers had always made sense when viewed individually. Hearing them discussed together created a completely different picture. Judge Carter eventually folded her hands. "This court is not evaluating success," she said calmly. "It is evaluating fairness." The room became silent again. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. For years, she had tried explaining how certain decisions affected their marriage, how priorities shifted, how respect slowly disappeared beneath ambition. Those conversations had gone nowhere. Now nobody was arguing about feelings. They were examining facts. The distinction mattered. Ethan looked across the aisle. Naomi was not smiling. She was not celebrating. There was no satisfaction in her expression, only quiet acceptance. Somehow that unsettled him more than anger would have. He remembered countless moments when she had tried reaching him. Dinners interrupted by business calls. Vacations shortened by meetings. Important conversations postponed indefinitely. At the time, every decision seemed justified, necessary, temporary. Looking back, the years appeared differently. Judge Carter reviewed her notes before speaking again. A marriage is not merely a financial partnership. It is also a relationship of mutual consideration. Her gaze moved across the courtroom. When one person's voice becomes consistently secondary to another's interests, consequences often follow. Nobody reacted outwardly, yet the words settled heavily over the room. Ethan felt them more than he expected. Outside, sunlight reflected off nearby buildings and filled the courtroom with a warm afternoon brightness. Inside, however, he felt unusually exposed. Not attacked, not judged, seen. The realization arrived quietly. All morning, he had focused on outcomes, assets, strategy, control. He had spent almost no time thinking about responsibility. Naomi looked toward the windows again. The storm clouds were gone now. Only blue sky remained. For the first time since entering the courthouse, she felt completely at peace. Whatever happened next, the truth no longer belonged to private arguments behind closed doors. It existed in the open. Judge Carter closed the final file and placed it neatly atop the others. The sound echoed softly through the room. Then she looked directly toward both parties. The hearing was approaching its conclusion, and as the late afternoon sun stretched across the floor, Ethan realized the hardest part of the day was not losing control of the narrative. It was finally understanding the story it had been telling all along. The courtroom remained quiet as Judge Evelyn Carter reviewed her final notes. The late afternoon sunlight now filled nearly every corner of the room, washing the dark wood surfaces in warm gold. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The silence felt different from the tension that had filled the room earlier. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence that arrives when people understand that a conclusion is near. Judge Carter set her pen down carefully and looked toward both parties. Her expression remained composed, professional, and measured. The court has considered the evidence, the testimony, and the documented history presented throughout these proceedings, she said. Her voice carried evenly through the room. The purpose of this court is not to reward one person or punish another. It is to ensure a fair outcome based upon the facts. Ethan listened without moving. The confidence that had accompanied him into the courthouse that morning was gone. In its place sat something unfamiliar. Reflection. Across the aisle, Naomi remained calm. She did not lean forward. She did not hold her breath. She simply listened. Judge Carter continued outlining the court's findings. The details were legal, precise, and carefully reasoned. Financial matters were addressed. Property issues were resolved. Responsibilities were clarified. Every decision rested on documented facts rather than emotion. That was what made the outcome impossible to dismiss. When she finished, Judge Carter closed the file before her. The soft sound echoed through the room. This matter is concluded. For a moment, nobody moved. Then chairs shifted quietly. Attorneys gathered documents. Spectators slowly began standing. The ordinary sounds of life returning to the room felt almost distant. Ethan stared down at the table. The polished surface reflected the sunlight streaming through the windows. He remembered walking into the courthouse, convinced he understood everything. Convinced success in one area of life translated automatically into wisdom in every other. Looking back now, he saw years he could not reclaim. Conversations he had ignored. Warnings he had dismissed. Opportunities to listen that he never took. Across the aisle, Naomi carefully organized her papers. Her hands were steady. There was no triumph in her expression. No desire to embarrass anyone. Only relief. Quiet relief. the kind that arrives after carrying a burden for far too long. As people filed toward the exits, Ethan finally looked up. His eyes met Naomi's for the first time since the hearing began. Neither spoke. Words suddenly felt inadequate. After a few seconds, Naomi offered a small nod. Not forgiveness, not condemnation, simply acknowledgement. Then she turned and walked toward the courthouse doors. Outside, the air felt fresh after the storm. The sidewalks glistened, faintly beneath the afternoon sun. Cars moved through the city streets. People hurried past carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Life continued exactly as it had before, yet everything felt different. Naomi stepped onto the courthouse steps and paused. At the far end of the plaza stood Evelyn Carter. No judicial robe, no bench, no authority beyond that of a mother watching her daughter. For a brief moment, neither woman moved. Years of distance existed between them, years of misunderstandings, years of silence. Then Evelyn offered the slightest smile. Naomi returned it. No dramatic reunion followed. No speeches, no tears. Some things were too important for words. Together, they began walking down the courthouse steps beneath the warm Georgia sunlight. Behind them, the courthouse doors opened and closed as people came and went. Ahead of them, the city stretched toward the horizon beneath a clear blue sky. Naomi took a slow breath and felt the sunlight against her face. For the first time in many years, she was not looking back. And in the quiet rhythm of her footsteps moving forward, there was something stronger than victory. There was freedom.